In the spring of 1973, the rain came to Ringgold County, Iowa, the way it sometimes does in the Midwest. Not as a storm, but as an event. 4 inches in 6 hours on ground that was already saturated from a wet March. The creeks that usually trickled through the county's gentle valleys turned into brown, angry rivers that tore at their banks and carried everything they could reach: trees, fence posts, dead livestock, and, in the case of Skunk Creek on County Road G61, a bridge. The Skunk Creek Bridge was a single-lane timber structure. White oak pilings sunk into the creek bed in 1941, with a plank deck that the county replaced every 8 or 10 years when the boards rotted through. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't engineered to any standard that a modern inspector would recognize. It was just a way across the creek, the only way across the creek for a 3-mile stretch between the gravel road to the north and the state highway to the south. And it served exactly one farm. Glenn Weber's 280 acres sat on the west side of Skunk Creek. Every piece of his life that connected to the outside world, the grain elevator in Mount Ayr, the sail barn in Kellerton, the school in Benton, the church, the co-op, the hardware store, was on the east side. The bridge was his lifeline. Without it, the only way to reach his own farm was a 22-mile detour on gravel roads that turned to mud in the rain and ruts in the freeze and dust in the summer. On the morning of April 14, 1973, Glenn drove his truck to the creek and found the bridge gone. Not damaged, gone. The flood had ripped the pilings out of the creek bed, snapped the deck like a cracker, and scattered the pieces downstream. All that remained were 4 concrete footings and a gap of 42 feet where the road used to continue. Glenn stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the gap. Behind him was his farm, his cattle, his equipment, his grain, his life. Ahead of him was nothing but broken ground and running water. He drove the 22-mile detour to the Ringgold County Courthouse and walked into the Board of Supervisors meeting that was already in session. Let me tell you about that meeting, because it's where this story really starts. The Ringgold County Board of Supervisors met the first and third Tuesday of every month in a room on the second floor of the courthouse in Mount Ayr. There were 3 supervisors, farmers themselves mostly, elected by their neighbors to manage the county's roads, bridges, and budget. The county engineer, a man named Dale Heitkamp, attended every meeting to report on projects and request funding. Glenn walked in during the public comment period. He was still wearing his boots and his work jacket, which was muddy from standing at the creek. He didn't sit down. "Morning," Glenn said. "The bridge on G61 at Skunk Creek is gone. Flood took it last night." The supervisors nodded. They'd heard about the flooding. Several roads were damaged. 3 other bridges in the county had been impacted, though none had been completely destroyed. "When can you rebuild it?" Glenn asked. Dale Heitkamp, 53 years old, a civil engineering degree from Iowa State, 21 years as Ringgold County engineer, opened a folder and consulted a list. The list was his project queue. Every bridge, road, and culvert in the county that needed work, ranked by priority, constrained by a budget that was always too small for a county with 700 miles of roads and 112 bridges. "The G61 bridge serves one property," Dale said, reading from his notes. "Single lane, timber construction, estimated replacement cost $45,000 for a concrete and steel structure meeting current standards. Based on our current project queue and available funding..." He paused, running his finger down the list. 5 years, if we're lucky." 5 years, Glenn repeated. "We've got bridges that serve 20, 30, 50 properties ahead of you in the queue. I understand it's an inconvenience, but..." "Inconvenience." Glenn's voice was flat. "Dale, my cattle need feed. My grain needs to get to the elevator. My kids need to get to school. I can't drive 22 miles of gravel every time I need a gallon of milk. 5 years isn't an inconvenience. 5 years is a death sentence for my operation." The room was quiet. The supervisors looked at Dale. Dale looked at his folder. "I'm sorry, Glenn. I don't have the money or the manpower to move you up the list. I wish I did." Glenn stood there for a long moment. Then he said 4 words that changed the expression on Dale Heitkamp's face. "I'll build it myself." Dale looked up from his folder. The supervisors exchanged glances. One of them, Harold Strickler, who farmed 400 acres and had known Glenn since grade school, leaned forward. "You'll build what yourself?" Harold asked. "The bridge. I'll build the bridge myself." Dale Heitkamp's response was immediate, professional, and delivered with the particular certainty of a man who has a degree on his wall. "Glenn, you can't build a bridge. A bridge is a structure that requires engineering design, load calculations, soil analysis, material specifications, and compliance with state and federal standards. You can't just weld some steel together and call it a bridge." "Why not?" "Because it wouldn't be safe. Because it wouldn't be legal. Because the county would be liable if it collapsed. Because you're a farmer, not an engineer." "My grandfather built the bridge that just washed out," Glenn said, "in 1941, with white oak pilings and a cross-cut saw. No engineering degree, no load calculations, no state standards. That bridge lasted 32 years and carried every piece of equipment I own across it. The only thing that killed it was a 100-year flood. That was a different era." That was a man who needed to cross a creek and didn't have 5 years to wait. The room was very quiet. I'm not asking for permission, Dale. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. The bridge is on a county road, but the creek bank on both sides is my property. I'll build on my land, I'll connect to the road, and when I'm done, you can come inspect it. If it doesn't meet your standards, I'll take it down. But I'm not waiting 5 years. Glenn walked out. The supervisors looked at Dale. Dale looked at his folder and said nothing. Now let me tell you about Glenn Weber, because you need to understand what kind of man decides to build a bridge by himself. Glenn was 45 years old and had farmed the 280 acres on Skunk Creek since 1952, when his father retired and moved to town. He'd been 24, just back from 2 years in the Army, just married to Connie Dirksen from the next township over, and possessed of the specific confidence that comes from being young, strong, and convinced that any problem can be solved with enough welding rod, because Glenn Weber could weld. That was his superpower, if a farmer can have a superpower. His father had taught him to arc weld at 14. The Army had taught him to MIG weld and TIG weld and oxyacetylene cut. By the time he came home to the farm, Glenn could join 2 pieces of metal the way a surgeon joins 2 pieces of tissue, cleanly, precisely, and permanently. Over 21 years of farming, Glenn had welded everything: broken plow frames, cracked loader buckets, split axle housings, hay rack supports, cattle gates, feed bunks, a grain bin door that International Harvester said couldn't be repaired. Glenn welded it, and it lasted another 15 years. His barn was a museum of repair work. Everywhere you looked, you could see the distinctive blue-gray beads of arc welds, each one holding something together that would otherwise be in a scrap pile. The neighbors joked about it. If Glenn can't fix it with a welder, it's not broke, it's dead. Connie said that Glenn proposed to her with a welding rod in his back pocket, which was almost true. But building a bridge wasn't fixing a plow frame. A bridge had to carry weight, loaded grain trucks, cattle trailers, his combine on a lowboy during harvest. It had to span 42 feet of creek without support in the middle, because Skunk Creek flooded every spring, and anything in the channel would get ripped out. It had to last decades, not seasons. Glenn spent 3 days after the supervisors' meeting doing something that Dale Heitkamp would never have expected: research. He drove to the Iowa State University Library in Ames, 120 miles each way, and spent a full day reading engineering manuals about bridge design. He wasn't looking for theory. He was looking for dimensions. How thick does a steel beam need to be to carry a 40-ton load across a 42-foot span? How deep does a concrete footing need to be to anchor in creek bank soil? What size bolts? What grade of steel? What welding technique for structural joints? He found the answers, not in the advanced engineering textbooks, but in a 1958 Army Corps of Engineers field manual titled Expedient Military Bridge Construction, a guide written for combat engineers who needed to build bridges fast, in the field, with whatever materials were available. The manual had tables showing beam dimensions for different spans and loads, footing specifications for different soil types, and, this was the part Glenn underlined 3 times, a section on using salvaged railroad rail as structural beams. Railroad rail. Glenn knew where to get railroad rail. The Rock Island Railroad had pulled up a branch line in Ringgold County in 1968, 5 miles of track that ran from the main line to an abandoned grain elevator south of Kellerton. The rails were still stacked in a field alongside the old right-of-way, rusting in the grass, owned by a salvage company in Des Moines that had never bothered to haul them away. Glenn called the salvage company. "How much for 20 rail sections, 30 feet each? You want to buy old rail? What for? Building a bridge." Silence on the line. Then, $15 a section, $300 for the lot. You haul. $300 for the main structural members of a bridge. Glenn drove to the site the next day with his flatbed truck and started loading. Let me tell you about the construction, because this is where a farmer becomes an engineer. Glenn started work on April 21st, 1973, 1 week after the flood. He worked alone for the first 2 weeks, then with help from his neighbor Art Lindsay for the final 4 weeks. The total construction time was 42 days. The first step was footings. The old concrete footings from the 1941 bridge were still in place. 4 squat columns sunk into the creek bank, 2 on each side. Glenn tested them by chaining his Farmall 560 to each one and pulling. None of them moved. The 32-year-old concrete was solid. He decided to reuse them, saving himself 2 weeks of excavation and concrete work. He did pour new bearing pads on top of each footing, 12-inch thick caps of reinforced concrete that would distribute the load from the steel beams to the old footings. He mixed the concrete himself in a rented mixer, poured it into wooden forms he'd built from scrap lumber, and let it cure for 10 days. Cost of concrete, $220. The second step was the beams. This is where the railroad rail became a bridge. A standard railroad rail, the kind used on the Rock Island line, weighs about 132 pounds per yard and has a cross-section shaped like an upside-down T. The flat bottom is the base, the vertical web rises from the center, and the rounded top is where the train wheel runs. It's essentially an I-beam, the strongest structural shape in engineering. Glenn laid 8 rails side by side across the 42-foot span, resting on the bearing pads at each end. 8 rails, each weighing about 2 tons, spanning the creek in parallel like the strings of a massive steel instrument. Then he welded them together. Not just at the ends, along the entire length, using cross pieces cut from the remaining rails. Every 4 feet, a 2-foot section of rail was welded perpendicular to the main beams, tying them together into a rigid grid. The welds were Glenn's art, thick, even, penetrating beads that fused the old steel into a single structure. This took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of cutting with an acetylene torch, grinding with a disc grinder, and welding in positions that ranged from uncomfortable to painful. Overhead in the rain, lying on his back on steel beams 42 feet above a creek that was still running high from the spring melt. Art Lindsay helped with the heavy lifting, using Glenn's farmall and a chain hoist to position the rails on the bearing pads. Art was 52, a welder himself, though he deferred to Glenn on every structural decision. "I can weld a fence post," Art said. "Glenn welds bridges. There's a difference." The third step was the deck. Glenn bought used oak planks from a sawmill in Leon, 2-inch thick, 12-inch wide boards, rough sawn, air-dried. He laid them across the rail grid and bolted them down with carriage bolts through pre-drilled holes. The deck was 14 feet wide, enough for a single vehicle with a foot of clearance on each side. He added guardrails, more railroad rail, bent into gentle curves at the approaches, welded to vertical posts made from steel pipe. He painted everything with 2 coats of rust-inhibiting primer. Gray, not pretty, but functional. Total construction cost: railroad rail, $300. Concrete for bearing pads, $220. Oak planking, $180. Bolts, welding rod, grinding discs, $95. Paint, $40. Rented concrete mixer, $35. Total, $870. $870. The county had estimated $45,000 for a new bridge. Glenn had built one for less than 2% of the county's estimate. Now let me tell you about the day Dale Heitkamp came to inspect it, because that's the scene I want you to see. Glenn finished the bridge on June 2nd, 42 days after he started. He'd tested it himself first, driving his farmall 560 across, about 7,000 pounds. The bridge didn't flex. He drove his loaded grain truck across, about 32,000 pounds. The bridge flexed slightly, a 1/4 inch of deflection at midspan, which was within the range the Army manual said was acceptable. He drove his cattle trailer across. No issues. Then he called Dale. Dale Heitkamp drove out to Skunk Creek on a Thursday morning in June, expecting to find a disaster. He told the supervisors at the last meeting that Glenn's bridge would probably be a liability nightmare. Undersized beams, bad welds, no engineering, a lawsuit waiting to happen. He pulled up to the east bank of Skunk Creek and got out of his county truck. He stood there for a full minute without speaking. The bridge was ugly. Let's be honest about that. It was gray primer on railroad rail, rough sawn oak planks, and welds that were structurally perfect but cosmetically rough. It didn't look like a bridge you'd see on a state highway. It looked like a bridge a farmer built in 6 weeks with $300 worth of old railroad track. But it was standing. It was straight. It was solid. And when Dale walked onto it, cautiously testing each step, he could feel that it wasn't moving. Not a vibration. Not a flex. The structure was rigid. He walked the entire length, looking at the welds. He didn't say anything, but his face changed. The welds were good. Not decorative. Glenn wasn't making art, but deep, full-penetration joints that had fused the rail sections into a continuous structure. The cross-bracing was at regular intervals. The bearing pads were centered on the old footings. The deck was bolted, not nailed. Dale got down on his hands and knees and looked underneath. The rail grid was visible from below, a dense forest of steel spanning the creek, the crosspieces tying everything together, the welds connecting it all into one piece. Water ran below, clear now, the spring flood a memory. He stood up, brushed off his knees, and looked at Glenn, who was standing on the west bank with his arms crossed, waiting. "This isn't how you build a bridge," Dale said. "And yet, here it is," Glenn said. "You used railroad rail." "I did. That's not a standard structural material for bridges. It's an I-beam shape rated for 300,000 pounds per rail. I've got 8 of them across a 42-foot span. The Army Corps of Engineers has a manual that says that's sufficient for a 60-ton load. Want me to show you the page?" Dale looked at the bridge again. He looked at his clipboard. He looked at Glenn. "I can't approve this as a county structure," Dale said. "It doesn't meet state design standards. There are no stamped engineering drawings. There's no load rating from a licensed engineer. I didn't ask you to approve it as a county structure. I asked you to inspect it. Tell me if it's safe." Dale was quiet for a long time. He was a careful man, a man who followed rules because rules existed for good reasons. But he was also an honest man, and the bridge in front of him, the ugly farmer-built railroad rail bridge, was, by any honest assessment, structurally sound. Off the record, Dale said finally. Off the record. It's overbuilt, way overbuilt. You've got 3 times the steel you need for a single-lane farm bridge. The welds are solid. The footings are adequate. The deck is properly bolted. If I had to guess, I'd say this bridge will carry anything you drive across it and last 30 years without significant maintenance. He paused. On the record, I can't approve it. Off the record, I'd drive my family across it. Glenn nodded. That's all I needed to hear. Dale wrote up his inspection report that afternoon. The official finding was that the Skunk Creek Bridge on County Road G61 was a private structure on private land adjacent to a county right-of-way, and that the county neither approved nor disapproved its use. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of looking the other way. Not an endorsement, but not a condemnation either. The county never rebuilt the bridge. They never needed to. Glenn's bridge handled every piece of equipment he owned, every grain truck, every cattle trailer, every school bus that turned around in his driveway for 15 years, until the district rerouted the bus to the North Road. Now let me tell you about what happened over the next 30 years, because a bridge isn't a bridge until it's been tested by time. In the fall of '73, 5 months after Glenn finished construction, Skunk Creek flooded again. Not as bad as April, but enough to put water over the road approaches on both sides. The creek rose to within 2 feet of the bridge deck, higher than the old timber bridge's clearance had been. Glenn stood on the east bank and watched. The water surged around the concrete footings, carrying debris, branches, corn stalks, a section of fence. The bridge didn't move. The steel grid was above the water line, and the open structure, 8 rails with gaps between them, let the water pass through rather than pushing against a solid wall the way the old timber deck had. That was something Glenn had thought about during construction but hadn't mentioned to Dale. The old bridge had failed because the solid plank deck caught the flood like a sail. Glenn's design, rail beams with open gaps, offered minimal resistance to floodwater. The water went through the bridge instead of pushing it downstream. Engineering by a man who'd never taken an engineering class. 1978, another flood. Worse than '73. Skunk Creek set a record. Water rose to within 8 inches of the deck, debris piled against the upstream side. Glenn went out with a chain and his farmel and pulled the debris free before it could accumulate enough to create a dam. The bridge held. 1981, the first maintenance. Glenn replaced 6 deck planks that had split from weather cycling, freeze and thaw, wet and dry. Cost, $22 in oak from the same sawmill in Leon. He also repainted the rails for the second time. The original welds showed no signs of cracking or corrosion beneath the paint. 1984, the county finally got around to inspecting the bridge again, under a new engineer named Tom Pratt, who'd replaced Dale Heitkamp after Dale retired. Tom was 31, fresh from a master's degree program, and had been told by the supervisors to take a look at that farmer bridge on G61. Tom expected a mess. He found the opposite. He tested the bridge with a portable deflection gauge, a device that measured how much the structure flexed under load. He drove a loaded county truck across, 36,000 pounds, and measured the midspan deflection. 1/16 of an inch. For a 42-foot span carrying 36,000 pounds, the acceptable deflection under modern standards was about 1/4 inch. Glenn's bridge was 4 times stiffer than it needed to be. Tom climbed underneath, the way Dale had 11 years earlier. The welds were still perfect. The cross-bracing was intact. The rail beams showed surface rust where the paint had worn, but no structural corrosion. The concrete bearing pads were unchanged. Tom drove back to Mount Air and wrote a memo to the supervisors. The memo said, "The Skunk Creek Bridge on G61 is the most overbuilt structure in Ringgold County. It is structurally superior to at least a dozen county-owned bridges that were professionally engineered. I recommend the county formally accept it as a county structure and assume maintenance responsibility." The supervisors voted to accept the bridge in January of 1985, 12 years after Glenn built it, 12 years after Dale said it couldn't be done. Glenn attended the meeting where they voted. He sat in the back wearing his work jacket, the same one he'd worn to the meeting in '73. When the vote was unanimous, Harold Strickler, the supervisor who'd leaned forward that day and asked, "You'll build what yourself?" looked at Glenn and gave a single nod. Glenn nodded back. That was all that needed to happen. Let me tell you about Dale Heitkamp, because this story isn't complete without the man who said it couldn't be done. Dale retired in 1982, after 29 years as county engineer. He moved to a house in Mount Air and spent his retirement doing what retired engineers do, reading journals, attending lectures, telling younger engineers how things were done in his day. In the summer of '83, Dale drove out to Skunk Creek. He hadn't been there since his inspection in '73. He parked on the east bank, got out, and walked onto the bridge. He stood at the midpoint, 21 feet in each direction, and looked down at the creek, then up at the welds, then along the rail beams to the bank. Then he drove to Glenn's farm. Glenn was in the barn sharpening a sickle blade. He looked up when Dale walked in. Dale. Glenn. They hadn't spoken in 10 years. Dale looked around the barn. The welding equipment, the torch, the grinders, the same tools that had built the bridge. "I came to tell you something," Dale said. "I should have said it 10 years ago." Glenn waited. "That bridge is good work. It's honest work. It's the work of a man who understood what he was building and why. I couldn't say that in 73 because I had a job and a reputation and a degree that told me a farmer can't be an engineer." He paused. "But a farmer can be an engineer. You proved it. And I spent 10 years knowing I was wrong and not saying so. That's on me." Glenn set down the sickle blade. "You were doing your job, Dale. You had standards to follow. I understand that. Standards are useful until they become excuses. I used mine as an excuse not to help you. If I'd spent one day, looking at what you were actually doing instead of assuming it couldn't work, I could have saved you a lot of trouble. You didn't cause me trouble. You caused me motivation." Dale almost smiled. "How's that? When you said 5 years and I couldn't build it, I went home and decided to build the best bridge in Ringgold County. Not just a bridge that worked, a bridge that would make an engineer shut up. I overbuilt it on purpose. 3 times the steel I needed. 8 rails instead of 4. Cross-bracing every 4 feet when every 8 would have been fine. I wanted it to be so obviously solid that nobody, not the county, not the state, not God himself, could look at it and say it wasn't a bridge." Glenn looked at Dale. "You told me I couldn't build it. I built it 3 times stronger than it needed to be. You're the reason it's overbuilt, Dale. So in a way, you're the reason it'll last 100 years. Dale left without saying much else, but he came back once a year after that, always in summer, always alone, and walked across the bridge. It became a ritual. The retired engineer visiting the farmer's bridge, checking the welds with his eyes, feeling the deflection under his feet, confirming what he already knew, that it was good work, and it was lasting. Dale Heitkamp died in 1994. Glenn was a pallbearer at the funeral. Nobody thought that was strange. Let me tell you about the bridge today, because this story has an ending that's still being written. Glenn Weber farmed until 2001. He was 73, the same age his grandfather had been when he died. Glenn's son, Mark, took over the farm and the bridge. The bridge was 28 years old by then. Glenn had replaced the deck planks twice and repainted the steel 3 times. The welds had never been repaired. The rail beams had never been reinforced. The footings, the original 1941 concrete, now 60 years old, had never shifted. In 2008, Ringgold County was hit by floods that damaged or destroyed 11 bridges across the county. Skunk Creek set another record. The water rose to 4 inches below the deck, the highest it had ever been. The bridge held. No movement, no damage. The open grid design that Glenn had built, the design that nobody taught him, that no manual specified, that he'd figured out by thinking about why the old bridge failed, let the water pass through without building pressure. 11 county bridges were damaged. Glenn's bridge was not among them. Mark Weber called the county after the flood to report that the bridge was intact. The county engineer, the third since Dale Heitkamp, said, "That bridge is the least of my worries. I've got 11 of my own that need rebuilding." Mark asked how long it would take. 5 years, the engineer said. "If we're lucky." Some things in Ringgold County never change. The Skunk Creek Bridge is 52 years old now. It has carried grain trucks, cattle trailers, combines on lowboys, fire trucks, ambulances, and, once in 1997, a county snowplow that weighed 44 tons, which was 11 tons more than Glenn had designed for. The bridge didn't flex. Mark's daughter, Hannah, is studying civil engineering at Iowa State, the same university where Glenn went to read Army manuals in 1973. Her senior thesis is about rural bridge design using salvaged materials. The opening paragraph reads, "In 1973, my grandfather built a bridge from railroad rail because the county told him to wait 5 years. That bridge is still standing." This thesis explores why and how the principles he applied, intuitively without formal training, can be adapted for modern rural infrastructure challenges. The thesis was accepted with honors. Hannah's faculty advisor, a man with 30 years of structural engineering experience and multiple published papers on bridge design, read the opening paragraph and called Hannah into his office. "Your grandfather built a bridge from railroad rail," the professor said. "Yes." "Without engineering drawings?" "Yes." "And it's still standing after 50 years. 52, actually." The professor was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to see it." He drove to Ringgold County that summer. He walked the bridge. He looked at the welds. He measured the deflection. He examined the footings. When he was done, he stood on the west bank, Glenn's side, and said something that would have made Glenn smile, if Glenn had been there to hear it. "Your grandfather didn't need an engineering degree. He needed a creek to cross and a welder to cross it with. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes a man with a welder and a problem will outbuild a department with a budget and a timeline. Sometimes the bridge that takes 5 years to approve takes 6 weeks to build. And sometimes the ugly structure, the gray primer, railroad rail, farmer-built bridge that no engineer would sign off on, is the one still standing when the pretty ones have washed away." Glenn Weber built a bridge because nobody else would. He built it with $300 of railroad rail, a welding torch, and the stubborn certainty that crossing a creek shouldn't require 5 years and $45,000. The county said it couldn't be done. The engineer said it wasn't safe. The rules said it wasn't legal. The bridge said otherwise, for 52 years and counting.